Ready to begin supporting English learners with disabilities from IEP development to supporting instruction. I am Donna Sacco. I'm a senior technical assistance consultant with the American Institutes for Research. I have worked and still continue to do some work with the Progress Center. I work for the Center for ELs and within our special education hub as well. Brenda, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brenda Ariano. I'm a principal researcher with AIR. Um, Many times I have a background supporting English learners, and many years ago, I actually did a lot of work at the school district level and in some of my early research supporting students with disabilities as well. So I'm thrilled to be here with you all, and thank you. I hope we have a great session.
Thanks, Brenda. So we'd like to connect you back to, if any of you were in that opening session and heard about the beating the odds, we'd like to connect you to the essential elements for sustainable school systems in the Progress Center's Beating the Odds report. We'll return to this graphic throughout our presentation as it helps keep us grounded in those essential elements. And you'll find that we touch upon many of these essential elements throughout our presentation, such as ensuring access to effective general education curriculum, belonging for ELs, and staff collaboration in particular. So for our presentation objectives in today's presentation, we will facilitate the exploration of considerations for developing high-quality IEPs for English learners or multilingual learners, examples of evidence-based practices for ELs with disabilities, and a teacher collaboration framework. Our agenda, and hopefully we'll stick to this, it'll be a little bit rough. So we're doing these welcome and introductions now, around 1:10 to 2, developing IEPs for ELs. At 2-ish, we'll take a 10-minute break. And then from 2:10 to 3-ish, evidence-based practices for ELs. Again, we'll have a 10-minute break and then come back for the collaboration framework. So we'll try to stick to this schedule as much as possible. Well, I'm going to move forward. We have a lot to get through today. So developing IEPs for English learners. Here we're talking about that part of the graphic, the individualized instruction and supports. This is something I bring up frequently, and Brenda's going to put in the chat box the actual link to these fast facts. And although they're a little bit older, it's the most current information we have. So in May 2022, the U.S. Department of Education released these fast facts about students with disabilities who are English learners. And the data from these fast facts tells us that in the 2020-2021 school year, 13.74%, so almost 14% of students in the US were served under IDEA Part B. That's students who are age 3 to 21, basically elementary through high school. 11.78, so almost 12% of those students are English learners. Now, this percentage is particularly significant in that when compared to all students served under the IDEA Part B, ELs are more likely to drop out of school, less likely to graduate with a regular diploma. And because the development and implementation of a student's IEP is intended to be reasonably calculated for the student to make appropriate progress, in light of the student's circumstances. See, we're tying it all back to what the Progress Center is all about, which is Andrew 2017, that this IEP should be a roadmap for providing access to free, appropriate public education. So it stands to reason that if you've got an EL with an identified disability, that IEP should reflect the critical data, considerations, aids, and services that address the student's unique needs that are related to that intersectionality of English language development, or ELD, and the disability. Well, I want to mention that IDEA does not dictate specifics for ELs in particular in the IEP. So over this, we're simply providing best practice or suggestions or considerations that you can include for ELs in IEPs. So I'm not going to be discussing in this presentation at all the identification of ELs for special education services, other than to point out where IEP development is within the special education process. So we have child defined, the initial comprehensive evaluation, the eligibility determination, and then the IEP development. And I want to point out this two-pronged approach requirement for the eligibility for special education. So as those of you who've written a lot of IEPs know, that for this, what the IDEA does say about eligibility requirements is that a group of qualified professionals and the parent of a child determine whether the child meets that criteria for at least one of the 13 disability categories, and the two-pronged approach, as I said, needs special education and related services because of the disability. Not due to a lack of academic instruction, or, and this is where they do talk about English proficiency, lack of limited English proficiency. So that is, the EL was properly referred and assessed according to the requirements outlined in IDEA regulations. English language proficiency was assessed with those results, were included in the comprehensive evaluation. Multiple forms of data were used in the comprehensive evaluation, ensuring a culturally and linguistically responsive process was used in that eligibility. And that within that process, the eligibility decision-making team included people with expertise in educating ELs and language acquisition. It's a lot, right? Okay, I'm looking at the chat, but I might have to come back to that as I continue through. I'm going to be looking at these 3 different screens throughout, so please bear with me. All right. We're going to be dropping links to the Progress Center's IEP tip sheets as we move through each of these components, but I just wanted to tell you we're going to be going through each one of these 7 required components of the IEP. The statement of present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, statement of measurable annual goals, description of the monitoring plan used to measure progress toward annual goals, statement of special education and aids and services, explanation of educational settings, statement of participation and assessment, and projected date, frequency, duration, and location of services. So many of you probably have these, the software that helps you write IEPs. And these required 7 components most usually are a part of it. So you can't miss out on those 7 requirements. We're just going to help you think about ways, best practices in which to use them. So at this point, Brenda's going to share a whiteboard with you. And we're going to ask, how does your district or state address IEPs for ELs? Actually, Brenda, before you share that whiteboard, I just want to note Massachusetts, some states have a statewide form, many states don't. Different school districts may use different software for their IEP writing. And one thing I did want to say is that, the form that I used when I was a special educator and ESL instructor, the form that my school district used, there wasn't always room for some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So I would add an addendum in a Word document with all the notes or things extra. So I found ways within the software that my district was using to do that. But I was going to call out DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They redid their IEP statewide forms, and they changed how pieces of that IEP address the specific needs for English learners. So they've provided some additional um, space within that IEP form to answer particular questions about English learners. So I want to ask you, how does your district or state address IEPs? If you're from Massachusetts, let me know how it's gone in the last couple of years since you've started using the new forms. Is there any additional guidance for EL's IEPs that you've gotten? And do educators collaborate to align IEPs with the, if you have them, individual language plans, if you have those for English learners within your district? So Brenda, go ahead, share that, that whiteboard, and it will have those 3 questions on it for you. Okay, there we go. We'll come back to that. So, sometimes there isn't any differentiation. Maybe there might be when you're going through eligibility, but maybe there's nothing that is policy or suggested procedures for writing an IEP. So I'm going to share this is an image from the Progress Center, which talks about this internal consistency of the IEP with all of those 7 components. So you starting with the
Donna, you're not sharing your screen yet.
oh my goodness, I am
Oh,
so
there you go.
I hit the screen I wanted to share, but didn't hit the additional one. Sorry about that. So this is an image that is from the Progress Center talking about how to keep all of those 7 required components of the IEP, that there's an internal consistency throughout the IEP. And Progress Center, a lot of their work talks about this, making sure that all these parts, the present levels, speak to the statement of special education and services and aids, and the participation outside regular education, the date, frequency, duration, and location of services, that the PLAF statement speaks to the annual goals, and they speak to the statement of special, so that there's this internal consistency through all of these elements of the IEP. And today the first thing we're going to look at is that PLAF statement, because this is one of the most critical pieces of the IEP, in a place where you really can get a lot of that information for the English learner included. Everything, this is the foundation or the roadmap, and it's where everything is built from for the rest of the IEP. So to ensure the IEP is a high quality, IEP should include, and I'm going to read this, but then Brenda's going to put in the chat the tip sheets on the PLAP statement from the Progress Center. She's going to put one in English and one in Spanish. So you'll have each of those links there. Also, at the end of this slide deck, when these slides do get published, there's a slide at the very end with all of these links, and they'll also be on the web page, so you can access them in multiple ways. But so I'm going to read this. All PLAF statements should include a description of how the disabilities impact, how the disability impacts the student's involvement and progress in general education, the student's disability related needs that will be addressed in the IEP, the student's current level of performance that can be used as a baseline for those IEP goals, and additional information such as strengths, previously successful and unsuccessful aids and services, and progress since the most recent IEP to support the development of IEPs. Now, that's what a well-written PLAF statement would contain, right? When we're thinking about PLAF statements for ELs, what more might we want to add to those PLAF statements? How does the student's English language proficiency affect special education and related services? What is the ELP score? What instructional practices have been effective in supporting the students' access to academic content? And the specific, when I'm thinking about, for those language scaffolds that might have been used successfully, what collaboration supports between the ELD instructor, the English language development teacher, the general education teachers, and special educators are required? What are the culturally and linguistically sustaining instructional practices with which the student best learns? So how do these strategies support access to the specially designed instruction, special education, the SDI? And what cultural background information is relevant to the development and implementation of the IEP? So those are some additional pieces that you really want to link, that intersection of the two, language development and the disability. You can also, for families, sometimes you can really get some very critical information from families, and sometimes it can be tricky to get some information from them. You can employ the services of a bilingual or multicultural social worker if you have that within your school or district. They can help you learn more about the student, such as, what's the student's formal education history? Has the student had interrupted formal education? Has the student's social emotional well-being, what is that like? Did the student experience any trauma, either coming to the United States or once they got here to the United States? And what are the students' interests? What are the parents' and the students' interests and hopes for their future? So those are some of the things that you may be learning from families, from the students themselves, if they are at the IEP meeting. You know, I want to mention, again, to call out Massachusetts, they have some fantastic resources to look at for students with limited or interrupted formal education or SLIFE. So some of these students who do have the limited or interrupted formal education, um, they may be refugee children who are fleeing civil unrest or war, while others may have had inconsistent access to formal education in their home countries before coming to the US. And while SLIFE are diverse with interruptions in schooling, there are a lot of different reasons they might have had those factors that conflicted with their education, why their education was interrupted, such as conflict in their country, migration, economic hardship, limited access to education in their home country. So it's really important to identify any additional supports they might need beyond what a standard English learner might need in terms of services or a regular special education. Oh, I love this, Emily. And so in Rhode Island, does the disability impact access to their LIEP, and do they need SDI to support progress there? So do they need SDI, specially designed instruction, special education, to help with their progress for advancing their language development? So I love that they do that in Rhode Island. Thank you. I'm going to move to the next component, but you can see how that present levels, the more information you have in the present levels, the more it will inform the rest of the IEP and what services are needed, the more that it will help you write these goals. So for component 2, statement of measurable annual goals, best practices includes the following, these considerations. What is the condition under which the behavior or skill will be demonstrated? What is the target behavior for the student to be able to do? What is the level of performance or proficiency that will demonstrate mastery of the goal? And so Brenda, again, is going to put in those links. I think she already has. Here they are for in English, the Progress Center tip sheets on the annual measurable goals. So some additional things you can think about for ELs. What are the specific conditions under which behavior or skill will be demonstrated? So these may have been included in the PLAF statement as strategies that have been beneficial to the student in accessing specially designed instruction. So I guess like when you think about what Emily was saying, I think about like, how is the student going to be able to access general education and their specially designed instruction? What ELD scaffolds can we use? And it goes both ways, as Emily was saying. But when I think about writing goals, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but what you could add is conditions or strategies that are used within those goals. So when provided extended wait time, using a personal bilingual dictionary, when working with a peer who speaks the same first language, when provided sentence frames with fading support over time. That's always a big one for me. I think when I was a special educator, I wasn't always fading supports as quickly as I could have been. Um, you know, um, the special educator can always collaborate with the ELD instructor. Ooh, sorry about that, to learn which strategies are effective. And I think that's, important to always keep in mind, that collaboration between the two. So for monitoring the progress on goals, it's really not going to look much different. That description of the monitoring plan, an IEP for an English learner as opposed to a student who's not an English learner, they're going to look pretty much the same. I'd like to just reinforce that the IEP goals are focused on addressing the needs that require special education, or as we were talking about, SDI, specially designed instruction and related services. So this helps separate them from the needs that require language services and supports. But I really think it's important for the IEP team members to ensure that they're looking at that language development alongside progress on goals and collaborate with that ELD instructor so that monitoring both at the same time, that there's an alignment of instruction for the student that could provide keys to areas in which the student needs more support and from whom. So we've got the tip sheet again for monitoring progress in English and Spanish. Now, this is another image from the Progress Center that is so awesome that it speaks about the statement of special education and aids and services. And I really encourage you to look at some of the additional resources from Progress Center related specifically to these. So we're looking at related services, and how that connects to special education or specially designed instruction to provide access and progress in general education curriculum. That in addition, the supplementary aids and services in general education promotes progress, access to and progress in general education. All of that, we can also include program modifications or supports for school personnel, and all leading to what we want is that school and post-school success. Now, the OSEP policy letter, which is also going to be in the links to at the end of the slideshow, we have all our links, but there's a Cantrell 2021 stated, it's crucial to the success of English learners with disabilities that teachers working with English learners with disabilities are trained on how to support English learners ELD, in addition to their mastery of academic content knowledge and their specific special education and related services. That letter is a really critical one that you may want to, ensure your school system knows about. But to support staff in implementing the IEP, this supports for school personnel, that's part of this statement of special education and aids and services. It could include regular collaborative meetings between special education staff and the ELD. And then under related services, IEP teams can actually consider including in this, and it would be part of related services, a provision of parent counseling, parent training, families, training in the family's native languages to assist them with understanding the special needs of the child and the skills to help them support the implementation of the IEP. So those are things that, I think when I was a special educator, I didn't understand that those pieces could be incorporated and included in the IEP in those areas, as I just mentioned. The explanation of the educational setting, again, each IEP needs to have this explanation. And I think for ELs, the thing that's really important is the least restrictive environment for that particular student based on that student's individual needs is so critical that they are included in the general education classroom as much as possible. They need that pure language, those pure language models. They need to have multiple opportunities to practice speaking, listening, reading, and writing across the course of the day. Multiple opportunities for response and for listening to high quality exchange and to listening to their peers. Now, for ELs, a state level, you probably all know this, a state level language proficiency assessment is required. For example, 41 states and territories use the WIDA access test and the alternate access test for ELs who participate in alternate curriculum. So the IEP team, and I really remember this working with the testing coordinator in my schools. There'd be so many special educators who right before the WIDA exam had to have a IEP meeting or have parents sign off on. They had forgotten to include when they were putting that participation in state and district-wide assessment in the IEP, they'd forgotten the WIDA access in my state. I taught in Virginia. And so either for the access test or the alternate access, like this is really something that special educators need to keep in mind. The IEP team has to consider all of the assessments that the students will participate in. And I know for me in my state that frequently what accommodations were allowable might change on an annual basis. So I have to check and make sure I knew, like, especially as WIDA started moving more to online forms of use. So you really want to think about um, what are those accommodations that are allowable, and what does this one, the individualized education program, what does this one student need to be able to access those assessments? So again, projected date, frequency, duration, and location of state services. Brenda's going to put the tip sheets in there. Not a whole lot different for English learners, but it's just really important to think about, where are the English learners, how much are they going to be with their typically developing peers in the general education curriculum, hearing language models, content, so they're really getting the core instruction and opportunities to hear modeling. So reflection. Oh, wow. That was a lot, right? There's a lot, and I spoke very quickly, I know, but as we're looking at this, I want you to tell me, how do you prepare staff for an IEP meeting? So if you're the special educator and you're going to have an IEP meeting, how do you prepare the rest of the staff for an IEP meeting for an English learner? How do you prepare families of English learners for that IEP meeting? And what needs to be in place for those meetings? So we're going to try the whiteboard again, but you know what? Go ahead and use the chat if you want to, or open your mic, whichever is easiest for you. So Brenda, you want to open up the whiteboard again, and we'll see. So I'm going to talk about this because I think Kansas. Oh, great. Thanks, Sarah. One of the things that I find, or I found as a special educator that was very difficult was helping everyone understand how to work with an interpreter and how to prepare for that IEP meeting. So under IDEA Part B, the development of the IEP must be a team effort, right? You don't come there with an IEP already and just like say, hey, sign. The required members of the IEP team are the student's parents, at least one regular education teacher who's actually worked with the student and knows the student, at least one special education teacher of the student, a representative of the public agency or the LEA, an individual who can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results. So that evaluation report is really important. Um, Other individuals who may have expertise related to the student at the discretion of the parents or the agency, and then the student when it's appropriate. Like for an EL with a disability, it's critical to include one or more professionals who can interpret the assessment results, just as Sarah was talking about, as they relate to the differences in language acquisition and disability. Some of those characteristics can be very similar. And often when I'm working with teachers, I talk about be sure that when you're using a strategy that might be really useful for a student with a disability and might also be very useful to scaffold language acquisition, that you use it intentionally. So when you're using a strategy related to the disability and when you're using a strategy that's related to helping the student access language development. So those are, again, key things to keep in mind. So again, we have an Office of Special Education Program policy letter, the November 15th, that I referred to earlier, that has some really good information in it for you. If English is not the parent's native language, the team or the local education agency has to ensure that the IEP process is made clear to parents. Well, how easy is that? I remember when I wasn't a special educator yet. My daughter was in kindergarten and had an IEP meeting for speech therapy. And it was overwhelming to me. Here I am with a college degree. I speak English as a first language and I get all these materials. And really, I think I understood about a 16th of what that whole IEP meeting was about. And imagine that you go in that and you do not speak the language. Also imagine there are over 100 languages that are spoken in the United States. So it may seem impossible to really, ensure that each family completely understands in their home language. So some resources such as language lines, if you're a rural community, are really helpful. Telephone translation, these all provide simultaneous interpretation. The LEAs should work with the state education agencies to identify any resources that they have and require. But once you do get an appropriate interpreter, the whole IEP team needs to know how to work with interpreters. Again, there are online resources for educators to access in the protocols, the behaviors for working with interpreters. And I really see this as being critical to working with interpreters. I have stopped IEP meetings if the ELD instructor or ESL instructor for the student, for the school was not at the meeting. I have stopped IEP meetings if there was not an interpreter for the parents. Not appropriate to have the student interpret for the parent in an IEP meeting, in a eligibility meeting. So, all of these things are really important to keep in mind. Now, let's see what time it is. Ooh, I think we actually have time for this. I'm so excited. So this came out of my school district long after I left. But the Parent Resource Center and a dear friend of mine there worked with families in Arlington, Virginia, where I worked for 12 years, certified in ESL and special education. They came up with this fabulous telenovela helping families who speak Spanish understand the special education process. So I'm going to put two different links in the chat. I don't know, Brenda, if you have both of them. Um, but we did a stories from the classroom. I did a stories from the classroom for the Progress Center. So one of them talks about the development of this telenovela, but I am going to share with you a little piece of the telenovela itself. So let me bring this down. It's called La Sopa de la Um, and this is the link that brings you to the website. It's got several episodes, and the people in these episodes are from the area. They are locals who their parents who have students with disabilities. I am going to play just a little bit of this first episode for you, and I'm going to like do the opening and then cut ahead to a little bit later so that you can get a taste of like the high quality. You can use these in your school district. Unfortunately, they're only in Spanish. I keep thinking, well, maybe we could get subtitles in all languages. But here, let me play a little bit for you.
Deliciosa.
Wait, Donna, do you want us to see we just see the PowerPoint.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, let me try that again. Hold on 1 second, my friends. Yay, put it on the wrong screen. Okay, there we go.
Wait, we still see the PowerPoint.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and start again. That's good to know. How's that?
Yes.
Yay! Okay, sorry about that, everyone. These are the grandparents. I love that the grandparents are included. This is the community I knew where many of my students lived, so it's fun to see this.
Lidia, ¿qué estás haciendo? Eso es fácil. Es una carta de la escuela. Tú sabes que los hijos se llegan en cualquier momento. Eso no es de nosotros. Por favor, deja la mesa. Mira, no estoy haciendo nada malo, solo quiero saber qué le pasa a mi nieto, que tal vez esté en problemas. No puede ser eso así. Mira, mejor vamos a ver la telenovela de anoche que no la terminamos de ver. La telenovela, vámonos.
Okay, I'm gonna move it ahead a little bit to the mom.
¿Qué es esto? ¿Estudio del niño? ¿Una reunión? ¿Algún problema conmigo? Oh, es hora de recoger a los niños de la escuela. Tal vez Karina sepa algo de esta carta.
Just gonna move it ahead a little bit. Here we go.
Hey, Karina. ¿Cómo estás, Karina? Bueno que te veo. Tengo una pregunta. ¿Está bien? No estás preocupada. Sí, sabes, estoy preocupada. Hoy recibí esta carta de la escuela. Es sobre mi hijo. y no sé de qué se trata. No sé si hay algo malo. Recibí la misma carta cuando refirieron a mi hijo para recibir educación especial. ¿Educación especial? ¿Hay algo malo con mi hijo? No, no te preocupes. Eso quiere decir que la escuela quiere hablar contigo. Algo debe estar sucediendo con el niño. Ven, vamos donde Jackie. Ella debe saber lo que está pasando. Gracias. Ah.
Buenas tardes, Jackie. ¿Cómo estás? Buenas tardes, bienvenida. ¿En qué les puedo ayudar? Lucía recibió esta carta hoy. ¿Se la puedes explicar, por favor? Claro. Por lo general, esto significa que alguien refirió a su hijo porque tienen una preocupación. ¿La maestra de Pedro ha hablado con usted acerca de las dificultades que le está teniendo en la escuela?
Bueno, en la conferencia de padres y maestros hablamos acerca de la lectura de Pedro y hace unos meses nos reunimos para hablar acerca de qué iban a hacer.
Bueno, el Child Study Committee es un grupo de personas que hablará con usted sobre cómo le está yendo a Pedro en la escuela y lo que han estado intentando. A veces determinan si es necesario hacer algunas pruebas. Yo también fui a esa reunión. Había muchas personas ahí. Estaba el maestro de mi hijo, había un psicólogo, estaba el subdirector y había muchas personas que ni siquiera sabía quiénes eran.
I love that this is like a flashback, you know, it's real people in the school system who are in this video.
Is she going to sign?
Estoy muy confundida, no entiendo nada.
She's very confused. Do you understand? She's confused.
También.
She's confused.
¿Por qué tanta gente?
Sí, lo sé. Le va a parecer que es mucha gente, pero cada uno de ellos va a compartir con usted información sobre su hijo y lo que han observado en la escuela. Y van a explicarle el motivo de la reunión. Es normal estar nerviosa, pero yo voy a estar allí para ayudarle en la interpretación. Y también puede invitar a quien usted guste.
Sabes, recuerdo mi primera reunión. Era mucha información. Me sentía nerviosa, muy confundida. Me costó mucho tiempo entender que era educación especial. ¿Educación especial? Pero eso no es para niños que tienen serias dificultades.
Bueno, mucha gente piensa eso, pero la educación especial brinda ayuda a niños con diferentes tipos de necesidades. Por ejemplo, algunos niños solo necesitan ayuda en lectura o en matemáticas.
Yo fui al Centro de Recursos para Padres de Familia. Ellos tienen mucha información, ellos saben mucho sobre educación especial.
So I'm going to stop there, but are you looking at the slides now, Brenda?
Yes.
Okay, good. You get a good taste of what all of these are and how helpful, you know, you can imagine how helpful families could find this, right? So I can't say enough about how important it is to prepare all of those members of the IEP team for working with families who may not speak English proficiently, but also for helping the families to understand what's going to go on within those meetings. So, and hopefully your school district may have some multilingual resources and people to help, resource officers who can help with IEPs.
And Donna, we're not seeing the slides anymore. We're seeing the Progress Center Zoom.
So sorry. Is that, now do you see them?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Hopefully that will stay like that. So when I'm going to close out right now before we take our break and just have you thinking about that collaboration piece, you know, with an English learner with a disability. I think of the student as a unique, as you know, being really unique, just like this hand woven tapestry. You know, it's colorful, it's complex, as an educator, we can accept that there'll always be continuous learning. You know, I didn't graduate knowing everything I needed to know. And each year that I was a special educator with ESL certification, I needed to learn more about those unique qualities of each student and family and learn more techniques for whatever culture they're from to help with that culturally and linguistically sustaining work with each family. You know, no one educator can really develop this knowledge alone. So creating those partnerships and collaboration within the IEP team members, with the general educator, special educator, ELD instructor, family student, any of the related services provider, social worker, school counselor, these all increase the chances for alignment across all areas of instruction in all settings to support the student. So the goal for students is that they're able to access and benefit from the general education curriculum. And for an EL with disabilities, the critical role of the IEP and the ELD supports working together to meet the individual student's needs, you know, those unique needs, that is of the utmost importance for each student. Different educators acknowledging and supporting the student's individual needs as an EL with a disability will lead to what we consider to be progress, and that is improved post-secondary outcomes in education, training programs, or competitive employment. So I want you to start thinking about this as we take a 10-minute break. When we come back, Brenda's going to provide some strategies for working with English learners, and I want you to think about, you know, when you're using a strategy, are you using it for the student to help with that disability-related need or the English language development need? And she's going to talk about collaboration too. So we'll take a 10-minute break. And it's just after 2 o'clock. Let's come back at 2:10 and I will pause the recording and we'll start it up again when we come back. Thanks.
Cognate work in this instance, right? Some cognates are tricky, right? You got to be careful with some of them, but I like asking them to think through, like, is a cognate, does it make sense in this context?
I remember a really powerful time when I was actually helping a teacher out. I was in the classroom. I wasn't the teacher of record, but there was an English learner in the back of the classroom who was frequently, you know, I'd been observing this class time and time again for about 2 months off and on during the week. And I'd see this English learner get into trouble a lot, be reprimanded often. And the general education teacher was teaching math when I was observing. And, you know, she was teaching quadrilaterals. And he was really struggling. He'd been put in the back of the classroom. And I just whispered to him, cuatro lados in Spanish, you know, trying to use those cognates. And he's like, "Oh, she speaks Spanish." And then it's like, suddenly he came, you know, and it's, you think like, for me, the reason I tell this story is it is such a little teeny moment, right? And it changed things for that student, just that one little piece of recognizing the cognate and helping him see the 4 sides of a quadrilateral. And, you know, other times I came in, I think I was modeling for the teacher too, how she could use cognates and how she could engage English learners in different ways. And we started then using more pictures with labels for the English learners. It was a school district where they had basically, you know, 2 or 3 English learners one school year, and the next year the school was over 50% English learners because a large community moved into the town. And so, you know, things shifted, and teachers who'd been at that school for years didn't have the skills, you know, they didn't hadn't been utilizing those kinds of things, right? So
Yeah.
sorry, I just wanted to step in and provide that one example because for me, it was just so powerful.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's great. So I think we're moving right along, which I think is great. And I'm wondering, Donna, if we kind of like push through, and because I think we
Yep.
had scheduled a
Yeah,
break.
I just moved it ahead. So I am gonna go forward and start sharing my screen again. Sorry about that. And here we go. Oh, sorry, I need to come back to this. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
All right. So Donna's been hinting at this a lot, even in her portion of this, but we're going to talk right now about staff collaboration, how it relates to the Progress Center's essential elements. So now we're going to tie it in like more specifically around a teacher collaboration process. So thanks for hanging with us. I know we're going through a lot, but right now we're going to launch a short little poll, and we want you guys to tell us about like when you think about your experiences with teacher collaboration in the past, what were challenges? What were the successes? Like, how did it go? So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, and let's hear from you all. So it looks like about 6% said that they had no opportunities to collaborate. Another 18% said the collaboration experience was fruitful. About 41% said the experience was okay. And
Mhm.
then about 35% said there were aspects of the collaboration experience that could have been improved. So sounds like this is definitely an area where there's some room for improvement. So yeah, it's a good topic that we can talk through a little bit. So yeah, let's go ahead and move along to the next slide. So, what does the research say about collaboration? So you guys have had, a lot of you sounds like have had some experience with it. At least from the research perspective, what research has found is that, when school staff have an opportunity to improve understanding and capacity to serve English learners by collaborating on planning and research, you know, and when they have these opportunities to work together and they share their expertise for delivering instruction, um, that some really great instruction and integration around language and content can happen. And so we just want to dig into that a little bit more. We want to dig into a framework, and we want to see how we can integrate this all together around serving English learners and even a framework for supporting dually identified students and kind of bring it home and maybe even get out of here a little bit early. And I'm sure nobody will complain about that. All right, so the resources that we share with you today, they were supported through the Route Southwest, where we developed this collaboration framework. We partnered with the school district, actually in New Mexico, and there was some really great collaboration that happened through that partnership. We really worked hand in hand, and they kind of like piloted a lot of the framework and the resources, and they gave us a lot of great ideas because they were on the ground doing this. And so it was just a really great collaboration. Donna's going to drop the link in the chat. You can either scan that, and as we mentioned, all the resources will be available at the end of the chat. But yeah, really take a copy of this. It's has some great nuggets in there, and yeah, we're going to talk through the framework a little bit more in depth. Next slide.
I was just noticing in the chat that Sheila was saying, teacher collaboration works best when there are opportunities to have embedded time within the school day. I don't know how many of you were in the session at the very beginning of the day today and the Wyoming middle school where they were talking about how that was a critical part that they have not even not only planning time, but time with their colleagues to do plan, so they could do their own personal prep, but then they had a whole period where they could do really strategic planning as a team. And, you know, that's something I never felt I had, but it requires the administrator to value that co-planning time. And it's really critical. So
Yeah, and I will say, I will add on to that, Donna, that, you know, the district that we worked with on this collaboration framework had very, very strong district support, leadership support. So that was very critical. And they did do this at all different times in terms of that collaboration. Some of it occurred, you know, before school, after school, you know, some of our training. And but the teachers themselves, when they met and did that collaboration, was all across the board, but they found ways to do this even asynchronously, but they made sure that some of these like structural and process components are in place, which I'll talk about. But they made sure that that structure was in place. So we'll go through it. So they made it work for them, but it was just important that they made sure these components were there. And then they just came up with some great resources to share across with each other, because we know staff and teachers are busy, so how could they set up that structure so they didn't always have to meet in person? So I think that was really critical. Yeah. So, you know, what we're going to be discussing today, it comes from a couple of some of the strategies come from I alluded to some of these earlier because there's some great strategies in some of these practice guides. So one of them is from this Teaching Academic Content and Literacy to English Learners in Elementary School. Also, there's another report by the National Academy of Sciences. It's a summary of research on key practices for serving ELs. So content comes from both of that. Next slide, Donna. And also the evidence-based framework for teacher collaboration. We really got the evidence base really from a research base around teacher collaboration within schools around how to enhance English learner students' language and literacy development. There was a small randomized field trial of school-based professional development focused on language and literacy skills for elementary-aged Latino English learner students. We also gleaned a resource from WIDA on serving, defining collaboration for multilingual learners. So yeah, just making sure that we're getting high quality evidence and not just kind of throwing anything at you all. So next slide. So I alluded to uh, parts of this framework that really were really important, like for this one district in particular that we collaborated with. They were sure to set up these structures, right? And so part of those structures were setting up structural features, which were we need to set up a time for meetings and we need to develop some group rules and norms, right? Who's going to be kind of running the meeting, setting the agenda, who's going to be, I don't know, taking care of the resources. And then also setting up some process features. How are we going to communicate with each other? How are we going to be engaging in relationship building? Because you're oftentimes they were working across teams. And you know, the framework talks about this, but especially as Donna was alluding to earlier, we're talking about like it could be cross grade, it could be across roles. So like maybe it's that ELD coordinator, it's working with a special ed teacher, maybe it's working with a gifted and talented teacher, working with those grade level teachers, right? So how are we going to build those relationships and not just see them as kind of like, well, you come and pull out my student for, you know, half hour, 45 minutes or something like that, but really building genuine collaborative relationships and having that mutual respect for each other. So that's very key for this framework. Next slide. Okay, so some of the features of the framework is that these collaborations they're conceptualized as cycles that are also supported by language goals. And so you know there's 4 cycles that are co-planning, co-teaching, co-assessing, and co-reflecting. And so we'll dive into each of these a little bit more. So why don't we go to the next slide? So first, let's talk a little bit about co-planning. So the purpose of the co-planning cycle is for educators this is really like, let's stop at the beginning and take some time to really develop what are those appropriate plans for pursuing our content and language goals. So this is a really important cycle. Those key activities that are occurring at this cycle is to really think about what are our language and content goals for that are for common students, but really like especially for our English learner students or dually identified students, really. And this is where the collaboration really comes into play across grades, across teachers that share those common students. And another activity is this is where it's important to like review those instructional resources, you know, your lessons, your materials, or distributing the instruction among the participants. This is where folks really come together and maybe look at those guiding questions and say, okay, what's the content that's going to be taught? What features of the content might be more challenging for our EL students or our dually identified students? And what are those instructional approaches can be brought to bear on those features? And what are the specific ELD goals? Or, you know, what are those specific goals for our dually identified students that can be served by certain approaches around this content? So this is a really important part of that cycle. Next slide. So the next phase of this cycle is co-teaching. And this is the phase when the instruction really is taking place with the students, right? And think about the context in which the teaching is occurring, the role of the teacher, and the ways in which how to be responsive to the student contributions during instruction. And within the collaborative framework, we give examples of various models of co-teaching. So, I mean, you can't see it here, but you know, if you download the framework, you really can't see it here. But we even have like little, yeah, like various different kinds of models of co-teaching that folks can engage in. And what's less important is like which of these co-teaching models you engage in. But what is really important here is really how are you all integrating academic core content, language, and literacy goals for students? And also thinking about how are those ELD supports getting embedded into the general education classroom, right? That's really the core of what's important here. And really thinking about too, like what are the applications to consider for the dually identified students? So this should be done in ways that are engaging both English learner students and non-English learner students in those language learning activities and really enforcing those ELD targets during the ELD specialist time or your dually identified students. So really going back to those learning goals, you know, really thinking about that. And then even going back to what we talked about earlier with the vocabulary instruction and those, you know, what are those target words or those target learning goals. So yeah, just thinking about those, you know, those specific target learning targets. Okay, next one. Okay, so this third phase is co-assessing. And I kind of hinted at some of this earlier in the small A's and so did Donna, but this is in the collaborative teaching context. It's focusing on, you know, implementing those formative assessments so that way to support you as educators in understanding where's your instruction succeeding, where can it be improved, and you know also it's important to be considering and integrating the conversation around assessment throughout the cycle. So for example, at the planning stage, really having conversations to focus on the goals for instruction, on how are you going to assess both language and content understanding. And then really the key here is to focus on collaboration and to facilitate that shared responsibility among assessment, right? How is the ELD coordinator also working together, maybe if they're duly identified with the special education teacher? How are they both working with the general education teacher, right? Again, that shared responsibility, that collaboration. How is everybody talking about that shared responsibility? Like if the student isn't quite meeting those language goals, all right, like what discussion needs to happen or what data does everybody need to be looking to make sure the student is meeting those goals, and like what's the plan if the student is not quite moving along as expected. All right. So then the last step in this cycle is called co-reflecting. So and this process is really just a chance to reflect and evaluate the formative assessments, right, sometimes we get data, but we don't have a chance to think about it. And this is why there's purposely a cycle on this, to really think about the prior step with colleagues, to talk through this, and then think about how does the collaboration cycle, what can we think about adjusting or improving for the next cycle? And then when you're reflecting on the assessment cycle, you consider, this might be an opportunity for those of you that are WIDA states. Maybe how can we bring in the WIDA can-do descriptors, for instance, to track student progress? Is there other data that we might want to look at? Is this an opportunity maybe to pull out the student's IEP, for example? What other relevant data can we bring in that would be useful for the upcoming cycle? Maybe there's a piece of data that would really help us to inform our planning for the next, again, it's cyclical, for the next co-planning cycle. So really that's the collaboration cycle. And as I mentioned, if you download the collaboration framework, there's examples of templates that the teachers in that participated with us use, in terms of like agendas or teacher reflection logs, activity lessons and games that they used. Like it was really great. Like some of those teachers, like they did things through the collaboration cycle. Like they were having their students, like they were doing like oral history projects, and they were doing some of the things we're talking about. Like they were having, like, they would pick target words as part of that oral history project. They were English learner students, and so they were incorporating target words that they wanted the students to use in those oral history projects, sharing out about their family histories. And then they were using like Flipgrid to record themselves on the Flipgrid to tell their oral history projects, but they had to like be sure they were choosing particular vocabulary words. And then, the teachers were getting together across grades and figuring out how are we gonna, plan my upcoming ELA grade level planning. And then they were talking about it and bringing in the ELD teacher, or bringing in the gifted and talented teacher, whereas they hadn't previously done that. And the feedback we heard was, you know what, and this sounds bad, but they were like, I hadn't necessarily seen so-and-so as a resource, like in terms of planning. And now all of a sudden, like they began to see their teachers as resources, instead of just somebody that would come in and pull out my kid for 45 minutes or sit and work with this kid. So yeah, I think it's a great framework, and yeah, so we hope you can find some of these resources useful. So we want to do a little activity with you all.
Brenda,
Yeah.
I think I just stopped sharing. Did I?
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering if we shouldn't take our 10-minute break now
I
and
think that's a great idea.
come back and do that activity you have, because it's a really great activity. If you all are game, we could use the breakout rooms. Well,
I like that.
Brenda and I will talk about that during the break, but let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do an activity around water rights in New Mexico, which is, I really like this framework. And then we'll provide some more resources for you that are related to English learners with disabilities, or English learners who are struggling academically and behaviorally. So 10 minutes, let's come back. Well, let's come back actually at 3:10. How about that? Okay. And I am going to share my screen again with this on my screen. Oh dear. No, I have to stop that. Hold on.
So this is one of those, there's not really right or wrong answer. This is really just like a think through activity. This is an example activity that we did with, we had a literacy project with one of our partnerships in New Mexico, and it's just an example unit we did called Water Rights in New Mexico. And so the idea was just having our educators think about, if you had a unit and you had your students think about, students would be exploring the various factors that have led to water scarcity in New Mexico, course, this is a big deal for us in New Mexico, and how this water scarcity impacts the state's diverse communities. One culminating task for this model unit could be asking students to independently write an informational essay that explains the factors that have led to water scarcity in students' communities and how the water scarcity is affecting students and their community's well-being. Okay, so yeah, part one is writing an informational essay. Another part of that would be students have to collaboratively create a student's water bill of rights. So that would be the student's task. And now what we're asking you all to think about, go ahead and, yeah, we want you just to think about if you were a teacher in this position, how would you collaborate? You know, thinking about those collaboration cycles that I shared with you all, how would you begin to think about how could I collaborate across grade level potentially? Maybe with an ELD coordinator or a special educator, related services, or other specialists that support ELs or duly identify students and peer content. So thinking about that collaboration in mind. So pick one area for there's I have a couple questions here. Just pick one of those and just jot down some of your ideas. So one of those prompts could be either what kinds of instructions or language goals would you identify for this unit for ELs or duly identified students? Or how would you develop a lesson or materials to support English learners for duly identified students? And we'll go ahead and drop those prompts in the chat. Now, what we're gonna do is
Sorry, didn't mean to
we're
do
we're
that.
gonna break up into some small groups. And so you can just discuss this with your small group. Just like I said, just choose one of these and let's just have a discussion with your peers. Yeah, I would love to just, I don't know if folks are able to unmute or if you're able to drop in the chat what you all talked about. Like I was just with one other person, but we had a good chat about like what are some like collaboration techniques that we could talk through with the other educators in terms of how to adapt this potential unit to accommodate students. And so we had a really good discussion. So, but I'm just curious what you all talked about. So want to hear from you all, not me. So please either
I can
raise
start.
your,
Our group
Yeah.
did a really great job talking about like front loading with vocabulary, talked about different ways that they can, culminating tasks would be maybe pictures, or of course, we had some idea thrown in. Thank you, Donna. We didn't think about the poetry. That was great. And, with the UDL, and just talked about ways that we chunking, like giving them so much of the assignment at a time and have checkpoints to where they would, turn in that part, we check it, we work with them. And just, kind of helping them if they can't write the essays, maybe having other things that they can do to be able to help them, collaborate with the students talking, verbal, being able to maybe verbally tell you and you document it for them. So we just talked about ideas like that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. That's wonderful. Anybody else want to share?
You can also put it in the chat if you're shy.
Let's see. Emily said to help students realize how water affects well-being, we thought they could work in groups or work with their families to make a log of how often and in what way they needed water, or even water as an ingredient in a product during the day. Great. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else want to share what your group talked about? I know in my group we talked about perhaps working with the ELD coordinator. Is there a way to like have sentence starters for students? to help them. What were some of the other strategies we talked about? I totally forgot my partner's name. I apologize. I think it was Robert. Help me out, Robert. I know we talked about graphic organizers, um, uh, short-term memory here.
Yeah, I think you captured almost all of them that we discussed, and letting students pick how they might express their water bill of rights, like giving them more than one option for how they might advertise their bill of rights, like video or visuals or
Yeah, that's right. We talked about how do we bring it back to the visual reinforcements. So yeah, giving them the options with the visuals.
I love that idea of the video, because I always think about what are students' strengths? So there are students who are really great, and I mentioned this in one of the groups, really great at music. So like with a water bill of rights, I can just imagine a song or a commercial, that someone could create if you have students who are, so inclined. One of my favorite students, like uh, he loved acting, and it's really how I taught him to read was through Reader's Theater, because he had a lot of difficulty, but he would be so much more motivated to learn the vocabulary, to learn the steps of what he needed to do if it was related to somehow creating a video or a play or a poem or a skit, so um,
Yeah. And I think we just talked about this is like just such a great opportunity where of an example where, the general classroom teacher, a great opportunity to talk with the ELD teacher, or if they're a duly identified student, with having a disability or an EL student. Okay, how do I coordinate with the ELD coordinator? Or let's say they have a reading disability. Like at what layer do I need to think about that, how do I support them with their disability? Like, do they need extra time? Or, like, what do they need to make sure we're being supportive of them? Or, what do I need to think about in terms of, you know, their primary language, their home language versus, English? And so, like, that is just where that great collaboration can come in. And, just really seeing that all of those different teachers and resources within this process. Well, thank you everybody for, being part of that, and just I know for some of you it's late, so thank you for engaging in that. I'm going to pass it to Donna. She's going to share some great resources with you all.
yeah.
Or okay.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to questions in a
Okay.
second. Actually, I wanted to provide some additional, and I'm going to be putting these all 4 different additional pieces I'm going to put in the chat. I wanted to share some additional resources. And these are 4 different links. And I will start with, can you see that, or am I going to have to stop
Yeah,
sharing?
I see it.
Okay, great. So this is the National Center on Intensive Intervention at AIR, and I know Emily Klein is very familiar with this, and maybe some others of you are as well. But you might not know where there are resources that are particular to students who are English learners. So if you go to their main page, it's intensiveintervention.org. I just always put in Google NCII and it comes up right away. And I go to resource by audience. And here we have resources. Whoa, how did that just change? Oh, special topics. I'm sorry. It's under special topics. And intensive intervention and English learners. So as you look at intensive intervention and English learners, there are several resources here. I'm going to resource flood you right now. But I want you to know where to find some things that could be very helpful. So when we think about students working with intensive intervention or data-based individualization as we use at NCII, we're thinking about those students who may or may not have a disability, but they may be struggling. And within this portion of it, the special topics, intensive intervention for English learners, there's a brief that I wrote with two of my colleagues. In fact, they on the RTI site, when there used to be RTI site, they had written a resource for ELs and RTI. And I approached them, Julia Esparza Brown and Amanda Sanford, I approached them to say, hey, let's do this update for multi-tiered systems of support for multilingual learners. And so in here, it really walks you through a lot of scaffolds for students who struggle, who are English learners, may or may not have disabilities. It also provides like some ways to look at within MTSS. Like one thing that we discuss are true peers. And we really worked with Sharon Vaughn to discuss, sorry to be scrolling like this, I shouldn't do that, but we really worked with Sharon Vaughn to think about what are true peers. And we changed, Julie had really coined the phrase true peers. And we worked with Sharon Vaughn to really think about new ways of thinking about true peers. So we walk through like a data meeting where we have students in their first language, Spanish in this case, where they have a reading probe as a progress monitoring tool. We've got the students and their language proficiency scores who are ML, those with IEPs, and we look at their data, right? And to come up with an idea for true peers. So these are the grade level line for all students. And then we have here true peer line for all similar multilingual learners. Then we have Chasito's progress, and he's very similar to true peers. But then we track the progress as we progress monitor with Pachito, and we see that he's not in alignment with his true peers and very far from ever closing the gap here for any of them. And so we talk about using the plus enhancement system and different ways of adapting instruction, and within every 6 to 10 data points, looking to see like, have there been improvements? If not, then making an adaptation. So what might you improve? I just, there's a lesson frame in there. So, you know, it gives you something to think about. We also have several other tools that I wrote for English learners in particular, but there are clarifying questions if you've done any of the data-based individualization work. So clarifying questions, considerations for English learners, like what are some of the questions you could ask about why this student is not performing in the way you expect? So NCII is one of the resources I wanted to point out to you. Let me go into another one. Oh, darn. I have way too many things open on my screen here, guys. So, so then the other one is that we have at AIR, the EL Center at AIR. So, you know, please, Rebecca Berge leads that. We have lots of our research and resources here. We have an early literacy program for dual language learners called the COLTS program. For early literacy, it enhances oral language development skills. So I encourage you to look at our website and look at some of the projects we've worked on. Then one of the things that we have done more recently is the Multilingual Learner Toolkit. And so I put all of these different links in the chat for y'all, but these are resources to support pre-K through third grade, and it can walk you right through how to use a starter guide, instructional strategies, best practices, resource search. And that's really pre-K through third grade. So that'll give you some ideas. But this multilingual toolkit, we worked with another company to put this together. Then in addition, here it is. If you do not know about the OELA toolkit, this is the OELA toolkit for English learners. They have a newcomer toolkit as well, but chapter 6 in here, and I'm just going to click chapter 6. This gives you more, and this is more geared towards if you're looking at eligibility. So, I've been doing this intersection of English learners and special education for more than 20 years. I've done research and writing about it. I taught it, all of the students that I worked with in Arlington, Virginia, the majority of those students, the majority of my caseloads were normally English learners. And that really, like, getting into understanding, is it difference or disability? Is this a characteristic of a learning disability or a characteristic of language acquisition? They look so similar, and how are we going to tweak that, parse that out and figure out, is this a disability? So this chapter, I think, has some good tools for that. And, I highly recommend downloading it, so that you have it in your toolkit of the whole EL toolkit from OELA, Office of English Language Acquisition at the Department of Education, is really helpful, but this particular chapter is for students with disabilities.